The subject I'll be presenting this evening is probably, of all the subjects in this 7-day series, the one I'm the most conversant with, because I've worked over a number of years, and one could say decades, with Indigenous peoples in both Canada and the United States. And I have some First Nation ancestry as well on my father's side and on my mother's side, and they're mixed European First Nation, Abenaki in Canada, Oneida in the United States. The Human Health Lessons from Indigenous Peoples, I've refined the title a bit from what's in the brochure, but we certainly will be dealing with the question of whole food nutrition versus processed foods nutrition, because that's an integral part of these health lessons. And I should mention as well that unlike my other presentations, this one is not extensively referenced. The reason being is that it's basically or primarily based upon a paper that I completed back in the year 2007 that was commissioned by the primary healthcare branch, or primary healthcare division rather, of First Nations Inuit Health Branch of Health Canada. And this paper was entitled Historical and Scientific Perspectives on the Health of Canada's First Peoples. And I had over 260 references in this research paper. And it would be unmanageable to incorporate that into the slides, so I basically left the bulk of those references out. But if you really want to know the sources, just get in touch with me and I can very easily give them to you. So we'll now get into the presentation. If we go back to the pre-contact period, looking at North American cultures, there were many hundreds of pre-Columbian peoples throughout North America. Some conservative estimates place their numbers at just over 1 million inhabitants. And their cultures were not uniform, they were very distinct, depending on their natural environments and the history of their migration routes. Here in the Pacific Northwest, you had a very particular kind of culture. The Plains people was quite different. The Eastern Woodlands people were very different. And of course, their languages were quite diverse. They had different kinds of political systems, styles of clothing. Their homes were designed quite differently, depending on where you were. There's a lot of sort of with the old movies, the Wild West movies of the 40s and 50s, 60s and 70s, you had a lot of stereotyping, sort of trying to portray North American Native people as all living in teepees and wearing these big war bonnets, which is total nonsense, because it was essentially the North Central Plains people who had that culture. Also, the methods of healing varied from place to place depending on their sources of medicines and foods. And also spiritual beliefs were quite diverse. Among the Iroquois people, who called themselves the Haudenosaunee, or the 5 and later 6 Nations in northeastern North America, they had some very fascinating practices. For instance, every year they sacrificed a white dog to atone for their sins, called the White Dog Ceremony, because white symbolized purity. Virtually all of their cultures did believe in a supreme being, creator, referred to as the Great Spirit. Canada's First Peoples traditionally lived very close to nature. And because of that, their system of life and healing was based upon what they observed in the natural world. Thus, it tended to adhere very closely to natural laws as we would define them. This way of life ensured a lot of balance physically, mentally, and socially in their communities. And when you think about it, there wasn't any need for rehabilitation centers because there was no use of alcohol in the pre-Columbian period. There was no need for prisons or hospitals either. In fact, the early European explorers repeatedly acclaimed the health and vigor of the peoples they met. Many of the First peoples of North America practice agriculture. And a lot of this was brought up actually through trade routes prior to the time of Columbus, originating in the Andes in South America among the Inca, and traveled through Mesoamerica, through the Aztec peoples and into the American Southwest, and then spread to the east and north, mostly, to some extent to the Midwest and north. And so, for instance, among the Iroquoian people, which is the culture I was most familiar with when young, they had what they call the Three Sisters, which were actually their primary staples: beans, corn, and squash. And actually, because among these indigenous peoples, many tribal peoples in North America believed that the animal creation were related to them because they had a common creator. So they considered them, in a sense, their brothers and sisters. And they would actually apologize to the creature if they had to take its life. And so, like among the Iroquois, who were very agricultural, they would dry their agricultural products, and that would generally run out in the springtime. So for 2 or 3 months, they had to rely upon animal food as well. So technically, for 9 out of the 12 months of the year, they were vegetarian because of their respect for the animal world. They also were very physiologically outstanding. During the Revolutionary War, they were allies to both the British and the American colonists. And also in the Civil War, they fought with the North as they were drafted in by the Union armies of the U.S. government. But what they found was they had incredible stamina. There were men in their 70s and late 70s who would actually go out and engage in these marches of 40 and 50 miles a day. They had great stamina. Among Canada's first peoples, there was a knowledge of the need for various vitamins and mineral elements and how to obtain them. Now, interestingly, I recall reading a report that happened early in the 20th century where 2 gas mining type explorers were dropped off by a company in northern British Columbia out looking for, I don't know, I'm not sure if it was oil or minerals that they were looking for, one of these things. Anyhow, they were left with their supplies and basically were supposed to return to a trading post like 80 to 100 miles away, 140 kilometers, whatever. And as time went on, they ran out of supplies, they encountered very severe weather, and their future looked bleak, like they wouldn't survive. They thought they would never see civilization again. So they began a march to try and find the nearest settlement, and it was a very, very long march, and one of them had a vitamin D deficiency and became blind because there was snow on the ground. And there's a technical term for that, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it because it's a real tongue twister. But basically, he sat down and told his partner to keep going because it was impossible for them to go together. He said, "We will never survive, keep going." So reluctantly, his partner left him there to die. And as he sat there a few days and realized his fate, that he'd never see his family again, he began to cry. It was quite emotional. And it turned out this was northern BC, not far from the Yukon border, a native person who was out, I don't know if he was hunting or what he was doing, but he heard him and walked up to him, and when he realized what the problem was, he led him by the hand, took him down to a stream, dammed up the water, and all these salmon began to bottle up where he dammed it. And he grabbed a salmon out, he took his knife out and he cut around the eye and told him to eat this because the critical nutrients for vision were concentrated in that part of the fish. Within a matter of hours, he had his vision back, and his eyes were fully functional again, and he survived the journey. So I mean, I'm a vegetarian, but there are times and places where extreme circumstances may require extreme measures. As we look here, the understanding of critical vitamins such as C to prevent things like scurvy, like the Inuit people, for instance, whenever they would kill a caribou, because there isn't a lot of plant matter in the north, they would always eat all the greens inside of its stomach in order to get critical nutrients such as vitamin A and C, and so on. And they recognized the relationship between these critical nutrients and fertility and gestation, and ease of childbirth. Some of the elders early in the 20th century speak of the oral tradition that there was a time when there was no sickness among their people. There was no aching bones or high fever, no smallpox, no burning chest, no abdominal pain, consumption, or headache. And so quite interesting. That, by the way, is taken from a textbook called Aboriginal Health in Canada, written by several doctors, and it's commonly used in many universities in Canada. As I mentioned, I didn't reference this material because of space. In the 15th and early 16th centuries, as early explorers plied the Atlantic coast, in all of their writings, there's no historical record that refers anywhere to any diseases or epidemics occurring among the indigenous inhabitants. The National Commission Inquiry on Indian Health, which was formed back in the very late 1970s, it ended its work in the early 1980s. I actually chaired this commission. And its research found that most infectious diseases were absent prior to European contact. This included these infectious conditions such as scarlet fever, typhoid, diphtheria, smallpox, measles, mumps, the flu, and venereal diseases. There is evidence in the paleopathological record of some minor respiratory illnesses and intestinal parasites, but these didn't cause any significant levels of morbidity or threaten their host survival. It was also found that the degenerative diseases, what we refer to as the civilization diseases, were very infrequent and in most cases absent. Mental and neurological diseases, heart disease, arterial sclerosis were very rare. There was some arthritis evidenced among the elderly. Cancer was very rare if present at all. And there were some eye disorders, but myopia was virtually absent. I remember visiting with Elizabeth Cass, who was an ophthalmologist who worked among the Inuit in the Northwest Territories. She mentioned in the region she worked in that when she was there way back in the 1940s, she was a very elderly lady when I met her, that among all the Inuit population, there was zero myopia, it did not exist. But they put the young people into boarding schools. Within 6 months, there was 98% myopia. And it was again because, I believe, of the milk that was added to their diet caused that to happen, cow's milk. This is late 16th century, so we're talking late 1500s. As my testimonies have told me, it's very rare to see a sick body amongst them. And they further assured me they've never seen any man there shaking with the palsy, toothless, with their eyes drooping or dropping, or crooked, or stooping with age or because of age. Edgar Lee Hewitt, who was a researcher on pre-Columbian North America, said, in bodily proportions, color, gesture, dignity of bearing, referring to the indigenous peoples, their race is incomparable, free from our infectious scourges, TB and syphilis, and resulting physical deformities, as well as mental degeneracies. Probably also free from leprosy, scrofula, and cancer. It is safe to say that nervous prostration was unknown to the Indian. This is Eric Stone, author of the book American Indian Medicine. Laskiel, who was a medical practitioner in the 19th century, examined a man whose face had been torn away, his rib cage crushed, his limbs ripped, and his abdomen disemboweled by a bear, yet had been able to crawl 4 miles to his village, and in 6 months had completely recovered, except for extensive scarring. Such records could be continued almost indefinitely, as all observers were so impressed by this ability to survive terrific wounds that hundreds of cases have been reported. In ancient Greece, Pheidippides was the famous runner who ran 140 miles from Athens to Sparta. This run took him 46 hours. The historian Seton, Thomas Seton, observed a young Cree who on foot had just brought in dispatches from Fort Capel, Saskatchewan, 125 miles distant in only 25 hours. I heard little from the traders, but cool remarks like "pretty good run." Obviously, it was a very usual exploit among the Indians. The well-known Sioux chief running antelope was given this name by his people in his youth when he pursued and ran down an antelope in a straightaway race lasting 5 hours. Now, dental pathology is considered a trustworthy marker of both disease loads as well as nutritional stress. As we look at archaeological and paleopathological investigations, they reveal that among North American indigenous peoples in the pre-contact period, on average, dental caries affected less than 1% of all teeth. Alice Hrdlicka, who I quoted the second night when I was talking about the absence of disease in ancient human cultures, says here, the skeletal remains of pre-Columbian date, referring to Amerindian peoples, are barring few exceptions remarkably free from disease. Whole important scourges were wholly unknown. There was no plague, cholera, typhus, smallpox, or measles. Cancer was rare, and even fractures were infrequent. There was no leprosy. There is as yet not a single instance of pre-Columbian syphilis, and there were apparently no nevi or skin tumors. Interestingly, a number of explorers in the 1800s going into the early 20th century, including medical missionaries, ship surgeons, anthropologists, and others, undertook a search to ascertain whether cancer existed among North America's first peoples. Reports on the Alaskan Inuit, the Athapaskans of northern Canada, and the Indian and Inuit peoples of Labrador revealed that not a single case of cancer was observed among them, and this involved tens of thousands of people being studied by competent medical observers. The first historically recorded outbreaks of infectious diseases occurred among the Montagnais people and the Algonquins and Hurons of the St. Lawrence and Ottawa valleys. This happened in the early to mid 1700s, whereas Champlain's first settlement in Quebec on the St. Lawrence was in the year 1608, so it preceded the infections by well over 100 years. So it's interesting, a lot of people have this concept that the indigenous peoples were decimated by European infectious diseases on initial contact, but that does not appear to be true in relation to this historical information. In fact, it wasn't until the 1800s and into the 20th century that we saw unprecedented levels of diseases like smallpox, measles, the flu, dysentery, diphtheria, typhus, yellow fever, whooping cough or pertussis, TB, and syphilis, and other unidentifiable fevers becoming widespread among Canada's first peoples. Interestingly, if we look at the patterns of disease, the trade centers became the nucleus for where disease outbreaks took place and the central points of diffusion of epidemics along trading routes that went into the more remote areas. This is because they represented points of convergence between indigenous people and Europeans. So we see disease striking specific people groups over decades of commercial growth, gradually culminating in demographic catastrophe, meaning a vast loss of life taking place. Wide-scale trading with settlers led to a rapid erosion of traditional whole food nutrition patterns and an unhealthful dependency on alien, disease-building foods. For instance, what was traded for the furs was white sugar, white flour, white polished rice, sweetened jams, tinned milk, tinned meat, and other highly processed goods, including lard, as well as alcohol. All of these foods are immune system destroying. Such radical changes precipitated a downward vicious cycle of physical degeneration, stress, immune system impairment, and widespread infectious disease epidemics. During these early epidemics, there was, in addition to the disease conditions, there was the issue of panic, because these people had never experienced these kinds of diseases before. And modern science has found a very close relation between the neuroendocrine and the immune system, showing the powerful influence of mental emotions on the onset, course, and the remission of these diseases. In fact, some medical historians believe that more people died from the fear of a dreaded disease like smallpox than of the disease itself. So we see historically that once refined foods became a significant part of their diet, and here, interestingly, I have pictures of some Pacific Island peoples. These are actually Maori, I believe, from New Zealand. It happened to them as well. We see disease and deformity greatly increasing in incidence, and infections as well as degenerative disease. We see for the first time great difficulty in labor, giving birth, as well as birth defects in children. These things never existed in these cultures that were living close to nature on whole food systems. There's abundant historical as well as anthropological documentation that the same pattern of post-colonial disease and physical degeneration shown by the North American native peoples has occurred among indigenous peoples worldwide. Now there's a very interesting experience or lesson we can look at, the Pima people. In recent decades, the Pima Indian people of the US Southwest have been living on highly processed and high-fat foods, and also following a sedentary lifestyle. By contrast, their Pima cousins who live across the border in northern Mexico follow the traditional Pima lifestyle, a diet low in animal fats, high in whole foods, mostly complex carbohydrates like beans, corn, and squash, and engage in abundant daily physical activity. The US-based Pimas have what is considered to be likely the world's highest rate of obesity and diabetes, while over 90% of the Pimas in Mexico are completely free of these diseases. And virtually, almost all the Pima of Arizona have these conditions. So again, it's not our race, it's our habits and our nutrition patterns. The overall health of Indigenous peoples in Canada further deteriorated because of a lack of access to a lot of their traditional foods. They lost clothing sources from the land. Traditional ways of life and economies collapsed. Confinement to small plots of land with limited resources and livelihood. We have to bear in mind that people need a purpose in life to be healthy. And if you wake up and you don't have a purpose, the depression and lack of motivation that results can have severe physical consequences. There are also limitations in terms of natural sanitation, and long-standing norms, values, social systems, and spiritual practices were undermined or outlawed. Let's look for a few minutes at traditional health systems, and I also mentioned taxonomies. These traditional systems were very well thought out and very scientific. It's interesting, on the plant side, we talked about agriculture the other night. North, Central, and South American agriculture was very, very advanced. In fact, I would estimate roughly 70% of the fresh fruits and vegetables marketed in the world today originated in agriculture in the Americas. These foods were not found in Europe or Asia or Africa. And the list is very long, everything from avocados to green peppers to the beans, the squashes, tomatoes. In fact, when the Europeans came to the New World, they thought tomatoes were some kind of deadly poison. They wouldn't touch tomatoes. They looked dangerous. Anyway, so they also had very clear classification systems for types of soil, for different types of plants, for animals, landscapes, and climates. In fact, traditional knowledge systems were quite unique in terms of understanding climate. Like in the fall, if you look at a woolly caterpillar, you can tell how severe the winter is going to be. the thicker and heavier the wool, the more cold will be coming in the winter. So nature itself has this wisdom that the Creator has put in to fend with and deal with what's coming. So we see here an understanding that both foods as well as what we refer to as medicines were healing to the system. In fact, traditional cultures viewed foods and medicines as interchangeable. In the spring, for instance, the Iroquois have the Strawberry Festival because they recognize strawberries are very healing to the system and they help eliminate a lot of the heavy waste from the heavy winter foods. So they concentrate on a strawberry diet while strawberries are out. And diet was regarded as a primary basis for sustaining and when required restoring health and well-being. Thus, foods were carefully chosen for their medicinal or healing values. That's wild rice there. That's either Minnesota or Northern Ontario. Let's see here. You know, it's interesting, Western science we see as a great embodiment of knowledge. Well, interestingly, Balick, who's head of the New York Institute of Economic Botany, noted, and this was actually in Time magazine, I don't have the reference, it was in Time, that only 1,100 of the Earth's 265,000 species of plants have been thoroughly studied by Western science. 1,100 out of 265,000. However, as many as 40,000 plants likely hold medicinal or nutritional value for humans. And Indigenous people did have a very intimate working knowledge of many thousands of these plants, unlike Western science. When using plant medicines, therapeutic decisions were based upon the properties as well as the synergistic action of whole plants. I'm sure some of you have heard of Essiac for cancer. That was a mixture of like 5 different herbal medicines. Herbal medicines are unique though because one herb, for instance, and we'll talk about it later on, I'll show you a unique herb, because we don't have time to go into herbs, there are thousands of them, but just as an example. Like Western juniper, which the Gitscan people here in British Columbia use, as well as people right across the country wherever junipers grow. You know, it does a whole range of things for the human body, at least close to a dozen different medicinal properties. Whereas Western drugs are always targeted to treat one disease or one symptom. And also have all these toxic effects. When the Creator made plants, He knew what He was doing. And He put into these plants properties that would attenuate any toxic elements in them when He intended them to be used as a medicine. But what Western science does, it'll see some alkaloid and extract it, refine it and concentrate it, and put it into a pill that's after it's patented, and then they market it as a drug. The problem is when you do that, you're asking for trouble because we've been counseled, what has been put together, do not tear asunder. It refers not only to marriage, it refers to the natural properties of healing plants. So let's continue here. The goal really was to reach balance within the system. And here we talk about juniper. There's a photograph of Western juniper. The conifers, including juniper and yew, which bear berries and not cones, were used to treat colds, wounds, inflammation, burns, sore eyes, rheumatism, headaches, and insect bites. Willow bark was widely used to lower fever and to lessen pain. Cherry bark was widely used as a sedative or relaxant, similar to some of the more modern relaxants like valerian. Cherry bark was widely used as I'm sorry, I already said that one, didn't I? Yeah. Yellow spine thistle was employed to treat burn injuries. We'll look at a few more samples. Yarrow, milkweed, calamus, sagebrush, and the mint family were used for a wide range of ailments throughout all of North America. Horse mint was used to alleviate back pain and reduce fevers, chills, or inflammation. And American ginseng is an adaptogen used to reduce stress, to aid in healing infections like the flu. It was actually first introduced into China in its traditional medicine system back in the 1700s. So we all think of it as a Chinese medicine, but it actually originated here in North America. Now we're going to look at just one more herb before we leave the herbs, because we can't go into the herbs, there's just so much. But echinacea, now that particular title I'm using is actually based upon the title of a scientific article published by the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology at McGill University, Montreal. And they refer to it as a miracle herb against aging and cancer. We always think of echinacea as, well, preventing the cold or a flu. Well, fascinatingly, they did 5 years of in vivo research on mice. Now, humans and mice are 97% genetically common, with virtually all basic physiology being identical. So what happens in a mouse is valid for what happens in people. But it was shown that daily consumption of whole echinacea is highly prophylactic, meaning a preventative, against infectious diseases as well as cancer. It's a powerful NK or natural killer cell stimulant. Now what was fascinating is a person ages, they progressively slow down. We lose our vitality, we lose a lot of things, just part of aging, as we say. The first line of defense of the human body are the natural killer cells. And as we age, our body produces less and less and less and less killer cells, natural killer cells. And not only that, not only do we produce less, but the killer cells being produced in older age are not as efficient, not as effective. That's why it's the older people who generally come down with a cancer, because this line of defense is diminishing. What they found with these animals is by giving them echinacea daily as part of their food supply, and they did this initially with young mice, and they greatly extended their lifespan by doing this, which was a bit of a shock. And in addition to that, they found if they gave it to the elderly mice who've lost almost all their NK, natural killer cell production, it restored it back to youthful levels. And number two, it restored the quality and the efficacy of the killer cells to youthful levels. So it's quite remarkable. In fact, they found that in many cases it reversed leukemia in mice and extended the lifespan of leukemic mice, many of them to live out their full normal lifespan. And then I quote from the article here, the therapeutic value of echinacea indicates that herbal therapy may soon see its debut alongside or indeed in place of conventional cancer therapy, especially since virtually all chemotherapy is so toxic to all other renewing systems in the body, end quote. So quite an interesting thing. One other thing I'd mention is I remember reading accounts of physicians in the American Southwest where echinacea is used, it's used all over North America, by the native peoples, and they had observed how it was used. And one case was a young boy, maybe 12 years old, had been bit between the knee and the ankle by a large rattlesnake. And his leg had swollen to more than double its normal size. And he was in great pain, and they were considering whether they would have to amputate the leg. Well, the doctor, having observed native practice, obtained fresh echinacea, also called coneflower, wrapped the leaves, and the plant is a poultice where the wound was on the leg. And overnight, the swelling had reduced and the leg was normal by the next morning, and this child was able to walk again. So incredible range of properties in these healing plants that our Maker has provided. So now we look at what we refer to as complementary preventive and therapeutic methods. So we know that plant medicines were an important part of their approach to healing, but there were many other dimensions. We've already talked about diets. There were special diets prescribed during gestation and nursing periods to ease childbirth, to reverse infections, to enhance vision, to increase endurance. And for instance, certain herbs will cause a mother's milk to flow more freely. Other herbs will make their milk more rich. There were sweat baths. We've all heard of the sweat lodges to eliminate toxins. Fasting was very commonly practiced. It revitalizes vital forces. It's actually, we talk about nature's 7 physicians. Well, fasting comes under rest. you're giving your body physiological rest. They found in the science of fasting that people who are anemic, by the 10th day, their red blood cell count has normalized. It normalizes biochemistry. Then we go on to massage, which increases blood flow, speeds healing of weak and damaged tissues. That was practiced. Clay and charcoal poultices were used and understood, neutralizing wound infections and hastening the healing process. Most people have no idea how incredible activated charcoal is. It has incredible properties. Hydrotherapy was used to enhance and or help to restore blood and lymphatic circulation. Heliotherapy was used. In one of the lectures to come, where we talk about killer diseases, we'll go into more detail about heliotherapy. But it can restore biochemical balance and strengthen body and mind complex, the whole body-mind complex. Deep breathing was practiced to strengthen the lungs and to remove metabolic waste, and water was abundantly used internally and externally. This increased endurance and, if necessary, ameliorated fever. Excuse me. There was also other kinds of specialized knowledge. This photograph here is a North American Indian bone surgery. It's actually found in the American Southeast. There was an adeptness in the surgical care of wounds and fractures when necessary. And there was also a knowledge of how to deal with hemorrhages, asphyxia, and some actually practiced mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And then we talk about the transition to modern or allopathic medicine. We see Indigenous groups in close contact with Euro-Canadian settlements, increasingly accepting medical assistance from the dominant society. We need to keep in mind that late 19th century, early 20th century Western allopathic medicine used some very, very powerful medicines or drugs, such as morphine, and calomel, which is a deadly poison, arsenic, and a number of other poisons. In fact, I was sort of shocked to find out that he didn't drop arsenic from the pharmacopoeia until like 1927 or 30 or something. Anyway, let's continue. This transition was influenced, of course, by spirit of intolerance, and in fact, a lot of the traditional knowledge and cultural practices were outlawed by the Canadian government to systematically destroy this knowledge and culture. And we had the residential school system, largely dominated by the Anglican and Catholic churches, which led to significant loss of culture and knowledge and language. And also there was other kinds of abuse that took place. Dr. Peter Bryce was appointed way back in the year 1904 to serve as the first general medical superintendent in the Federal Department of Interior and Indian Affairs. So the first thing he did was launch a thorough exam on the status of Indian health. He toured the residential schools in the prairies, found they were breeding grounds for tuberculosis. In the recent 15-year period, he reported 24%, or 1 in 4 of all the pupils in the schools had died. In one school, 75% of the students were dead by the end of 16 years of operation. He also found that the population was regressing, not increasing. It should have increased by 20,000 by between 1904 and 1917, but it had actually had a decline of over 1,600 people. 1922, in outrage by what he'd discovered, he published privately, because he couldn't get government funding, a book entitled The Story of a National Crime, in which he talked about Indigenous peoples dying at a rate more than double that of the general population, and in some provinces, a 300% greater death rate. So now let's turn over to Dr. Weston Price's global research. How many of you have heard of Weston Price in nutrition and physical regeneration? I see a few hands. This is very interesting because I have 76 years ago. I should have changed that because this is a few years old. It's now about 78 years ago. But it took him 9 years and about 150,000 miles of travel. He traveled to basically all the inhabited continents where there were still indigenous peoples, and he observed the peoples in these regions who were still following their traditional whole food nutrition patterns, where he observed superb physical development, undecayed teeth, the absence of physical disease, and markedly less mental and social disease. But he found and observed other groups living nearby who were exposed to the highly processed foods of commerce, such as white flour, white sugar, tin milk, etc. And there observed a variety of infectious and degenerative diseases which had now become prevalent, as well as pandemic dental decay and pyorrhea. He also saw a marked increase in women experiencing complications during pregnancy and childbirth. He traveled to northern Canada, to the Yukon Territory, in the Pelly Mountain region. He examined, and these were people still living on traditional whole foods, he examined 2,464 teeth of 87 native people, and out of that vast number of teeth, found only 4 with any dental decay. A 0.16% figure. And there was also the absence of both degenerative and infectious diseases in this population group. He then traveled downriver to the Stikine River, which I think crosses over into BC, in the Yukon. And there, where the indigenous peoples had full access to processed foods, he found dental decay rates running at 40% of the teeth in their mouths. Quite amazing change. And in his words, he says, at the point of contact with the foods of modern civilization, he saw 20 Indian homes where there were 10 bedridden cripples in 20 homes. We see there a boy on crutches, and he found that tuberculosis was very prevalent where the foods of commerce were being eaten and was taking a severe toll on the children born at this center. And what's the Western medicine's answer to tuberculosis? The BCG vaccine, which we talked about the other night, is not only useless, but it actually increases the incidence of the disease, according to studies in both Asia and Africa. As a dental surgeon, he observed major increases as well in what we refer to as congenital anomalies, meaning facial deformities, a narrowing of the face, narrowing of the arches, crowding of the teeth, narrowing of the chin, and narrowing of the nostrils. It was additionally found that this disturbed heredity and quality of life is to a great degree reversible by a simple return to traditional whole food diets. And what's interesting is the new science of epigenetics is saying the same thing, finally, that it isn't just what we inherit, it isn't just our genes. We are able to turn on genes that will make us stronger and healthier, or we can turn them off depending on our choices and our lifestyle practices. If we look at North Americans, Canada, US, mainstream society, it's estimated that 75%, or 3 out of 4 people in North America, have distinct irregularities in the development of their dental arches and their facial form. A study done in 1930 looking at 1,276 skulls of the Inca people, which were basically in Peru and maybe part of Bolivia. The skulls were systematically examined and failed to find a single instance of dental arch deformity. And it was concluded that this was the result of a system of living using whole food nutrition in the early formative period, which is very closely in accord with nature's fundamental laws of reproduction. Now, this is quite fascinating. I took the data in Weston Price's book and basically put it into a table format so we could see it graphically. And here we're looking at the major minerals. Here we see dietary intake in milligrams, and we're using the RDA, required daily allowance, which was established in 1989. That's the yellow, which is very, very low, as you can see. The Canadian Indian is the teal color, which is several 100%, 700 or 800% higher in magnesium than the RDA. The Arctic, even higher, well over 1,000% higher. The phosphorus, higher among the Canadian Indian, probably, 8 or 900% higher. Phosphorus, 700 or 800% higher among the Inuit. Huge difference. Calcium in the diet, several 100% higher. Again, not quite as dramatic as phosphorus, but still extremely high. So I remember traveling in Fiji in the South Pacific, and I was shown tables of the Fijian diet in the 1800s compared to modern times. It was almost identical to this. The dietary patterns of the Fijian people was extraordinarily high levels of various major and minor minerals as well as vitamins, in contrast to the late 20th century, early 21st century. Let's continue. We're now going to look at some of the minor minerals. Copper, again, about 400% higher among the Canadian than the RDA, and about close to 500% higher among the Inuit. And here we see iron in the diet, again, extremely and significantly higher. So let's continue. This here are the fat-soluble vitamins, intake in international units. The vitamin D, which is almost a flat yellow line, very, very low. I would estimate that's about close to 1,000% higher vitamin D rate. And by the way, this is a combined Canadian, Indian, and Arctic Inuit. Close to 1,000% higher. Vitamin D, as we know, is a very critical anti-infectious vitamin. Vitamin A, also wide-spectrum antiviral, antibacterial, well over 1,000% higher than the RDA limits. So quite fascinating, evidence as to what eating whole foods grown on undepleted soils, because those soils were not depleted, they were feeding upon, unlike modern agriculture soils, which are drastically depleted and food deficient, mineral deficient. So we now see this growing epidemic of degenerative diseases occurring. By the mid-20th century, we see a range of diseases that did not exist traditionally taking place. Diseases like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, arthritis, ulcers, gallbladder disease, heart disease, cancer. These diseases were virtually unknown in their traditional cultures. But today, these diseases are being experienced by Indigenous peoples at rates that are even greater than the mainstream population, which I think is a considerable tragedy. The U.S. Indian Health Service expends over $3 billion using allopathic medicine to deal with these health needs and conditions for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And they continue to be over 700% more likely to die from alcoholism, 650% more likely to die from tuberculosis, 420% more likely to die from diabetes, 280% more likely to die from accidents, and 52% more likely to die from pneumonia or influenza than other citizens of the United States. In the year 2005, we see Phil Fontaine and then Prime Minister Paul Martin. He observed that, referring to our people, First Nations people, die 5 to 8 years earlier than the average Canadian. Infant mortality is double the Canadian average. We experience a burden of infectious disease with 8 times the rate of tuberculosis, 6 times the rate of HIV infection. The First Nations health gap continues throughout the spectrum of diseases with 3 to 5 times the diabetes, twice the cancer, and 5 times the unintentional injury rates compared to the average Canadian. So why is TB so high? Interestingly, a mid-20th century nutrition survey conducted in a northern Manitoba First Nation found very alarming vitamin C deficiency rates. On average, the dietary intake was less than 1/71. It's like 1/71, like that's a small figure, almost incomprehensible in terms of the deficiency level of the RDA. And we've seen how high the RDAs are. They're ridiculously low. The TB death rate in this community then stood at 1,400 per 100,000 compared to 27 per 100,000 in mainstream Canadian population. That's over 50 times, that's like 5,000% higher than the general population rate. So we see greater incidences of diabetes in First Nation men versus Canadian men. We see higher rates of diabetes among First Nations women, significantly higher than the white being mainstream. Very, very high, several 100% higher, especially among women. We see cancer rates in First Nations escalating and now being higher. In fact, if we go back pre-1950, cancer was still almost non-existent. It's only since 1950 that it's become very prevalent among First Nations. Here we see cardiovascular disease. This is the American Indian data. It's at virtually double the rate of the mainstream population among men and women. And reported cases of AIDS and positive HIV tests is also significantly higher, about double. Suicide is also significantly higher, 4 times higher than among the mainstream population. The highest reported for any culture group in the world. Optimal nutrition appears to play a significant role in reversing behavioral pathologies. A study back in 1983 looked at 3,000 incarcerated teenagers who routinely were using highly refined and junk foods. Their diets were replaced with natural whole foods. During the year in which their diets were changed, violent and antisocial incidents decreased significantly, including a 75% reduction in the use of restraints and a 100% reduction in suicides. So nutrition plays a very pivotal role in mental health and behavior. So where lies the answer? Health and disease. We're coming to the end of the presentation. Despite the many billions of dollars, and by the way, the budget here in Canada for First Nation and Inuit health is close to $2 billion or higher. And what is it accomplishing? Virtually nothing, really. A whole different approach needs to be taken, as you can see. But despite the many billions expended to expand delivery of medical services, chronically significant health disparities continue to persist, and a worsening of degenerative disease incidence is occurring. And it seems self-evident that the more extensive investments in medical services is not the primary answer for preventing disease or for restoring and maintaining health. The popularized idea is that we should make war on disease, that we need to deal with bacteria as an invader, but this has allowed both politicians and the medical community to sidestep more controversial issues of health and disease causation. As long as the enemy is a germ, then they can make war on it with their vaccines and their drugs, while also making war on the human constitution. But the reality is that disease wars is not the answer. The toxicological weaponry of selective medicine is not the answer, for it leaves untouched prevailing social inequities, as well as economic injustices, as well as a way of understanding and relating to the natural world that provides health. And that is the intersectoral prerequisites of health. And that is uncontaminated natural environment, outdoor exercise, potable water, organic, whole foods grown on healthy soils, adequate housing, sound sanitation, practical education of mind, body, and spirit, and meaningful employment. And it's the end of this presentation.